So imagine this scenario. Your organization is hit by some e-crime group. They drop ransomware in your environment, and business comes to a screeching halt. Your team works all night, and you've gotten them out of your system, so you're all good there. But now leadership says that ransom payment is not an option, so you have to restore, and quickly. You get to your backups, nothing. They're not there. They can't be accessed. The servers can't be seen. They were supposed to be immutable, so what happened? Business can't continue. Your boss is breathing down your neck. Customers are panicking, and you get a call from Krebs. So what are we going to talk about today is data immutability. We'll give you some background on it, some vendor case studies, and recommendations for securing the environments. Also, why you might want to include them in your testing landscape. I'm Ryan Kane. I've been at Northwestern Mutual for about 9 years. I'm a pen tester, red teamer, and a volunteer at CypherCon in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
And I'm Rishank. I work with Ryan at Northwestern Mutual, where I spend my time doing pen testing, red teaming, purple teaming, and some security research. This is my first time presenting at Black Hat and also my first time attending Black Hat. So let's go over why did we select immutable backups or backups in general as a target for our security research. We noticed a trend that ransomware groups were on the rise, and they would specifically go after immutable backups or just backups. And the idea behind them going after them is pretty straightforward, because if a ransomware group or a threat actor is able to prevent an organization from restoring their backups, it's easier for them to force payment out of them. And as far as an example goes, we point out this intelligence report from CrowdStrike where they call out Alpha Spider, which uses the Alpha V ransomware to destroy backups. Now let's go over some concepts of data immutability that's going to be relevant for the rest of the talk. The first one is write once, read many, also known as worm. So worm devices, or the vendor case studies that we're going to see, the 3 devices are classified as worm devices. And by that I mean these devices let you write data to it once, lock it with an immutability flag, and from that point onwards, you can only read from that data set. And why worm devices are necessary? Because now you have a clean data set that's it's locked in, and you can use it to recover from a potentially dangerous situation like a ransomware attack or just your day-to-day disaster recovery operations. And the way these worm devices work is through something called as a retention lock or a vault lock. And with retention lock, you can define an upper limit of time expiration. So one of the vendor devices we'll see lets you set a time limit of 70 years. So you can make your data immutable for 70 years. That's 70 years. Just imagine that. And the way this retention lock works is in 2 different modes. The first one is governance mode, which is the less stricter of the 2. And you can still undo the immutability flag before the time period expires when it's set to governance mode if certain conditions are met. And the second mode, which happens to be the much stricter of the 2 and also happens to be the current industry standard, is compliance mode, where once you set your data with retention lock compliance mode enabled, it is locked till the time period expires. Doesn't matter. You can't do anything short of just wiping the entire device down and starting all from scratch. Not even like root or admin privileges can help you out with that.
So why is this testing needed? Our organization uses this for ransomware resilience, but also just general disaster recovery scenarios. We rely on these solutions to give us access to our backups and restore in a timely fashion if it comes to it, if we need it. So our expectations going in were that we needed to learn about the solutions and the concepts that we just described. We didn't really know anything about them going in, so we had to learn a lot of it. We pretty quickly realized that attacking the immutability itself was pretty pointless. That's what these solutions do, right? You had one job. They do it really well, so attacking the immutability didn't make a lot of sense to us. Instead, we thought we'd just attack the servers and infrastructure hosting the data. That might be a lot more productive. So the solutions that we tested, 2 physical and then 1 in the cloud, were Data Domain from Dell EMC and DS8000 from IBM for the physical devices, and AWS backup.
So let's go over our first vendor case study. That's Data Domain Operating System from Dell EMC, which is also known as DDoS. At the time of testing, this was set up with version 7.7 with retention lock compliance mode enabled. So as you recall, it's the much stricter and the current industry standard. So we began our security research looking at some of the pre-existing work out there from other researchers, and the research on this particular device was pretty thin. At the time of when we were looking at it, we saw one CVE for a local PrivEsk, but apart from that, there wasn't much information on it. And when we tried to get more information on it by reaching out to our contacts on Dell, there was nothing. It's pretty thin. So we had to learn about this device from scratch.
So we interact with DDoS through the DD shell. They do have a web interface. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at that. We mostly focused on the DD shell. It's in a Nix environment. It's a lockdown shell that's got a lot of options, a lot of different commands that you can run, but nothing that can really impact anything outside of this jailed session. You're very locked down. We did spend a lot of time looking at that, and there are hundreds of commands, but it's all very locked down to the shell, to the point maybe outside of the shell you could read a file. That might be about it. It was hard to tell. There was a lot to it. There is a systems engineer mode, or SE mode, that lets you do a little bit more on the system side, like setting up protocols, setting up users, things like that. We interacted with it through vaulted AD accounts. Those were given to us by the backup team. They had admin level access, so we started with admin. But there were local accounts in the system that also had admin level rights, but we were not given those accounts or access to those accounts. We had to get those ourselves. There is a bash shell inside of it that you can get to through the DD shell, and we'll show that here. So you would run system bash enter with an admin set of creds. It will then prompt you for a second set of creds for a security role, for the security role user, somebody with that set of those rights. Ideally, they should be different people or different vaulted creds, but in this case, we're just showing this example. There are a lot of commands that require both sets of credentials, but in this case, not just both sets of credentials, you also need the bash key. You would get the bash key, say being on a support call with Dell, they would give you the key that will last for a few hours, and that gets you into bash to do whatever you might need to do to support the system in bash. It kind of works like the scene in war games where both users have to turn their key at the same time to launch the nukes. They both have to agree to it. But if sec user doesn't agree, then sysadmin has to use more persuasive means. So we spent a lot of time in DD shell viewing options, reading documentation, looking at the help docs in the shell itself. We tried all sorts of attacks, overwriting the data, which we knew wasn't going to work, unmounting the file system, rogue NTP server. We'll get to those later. We spent a lot of time trying all sorts of things and failing all over the place. Dell had thought of everything we thought we could do. Eventually, we found an undocumented command in some knowledge base article online somewhere called reg, and it's like a registry command. So you would run reg show config, and it'll give you a huge list of configurations, and some of them were cron jobs running as root. That looks like this. We would run reg set this DB handler config. We'd set it to run as root, to touch a file in the Ryan home directory. We just set up a local account just to test with so we didn't damage anything real. To touch a file in the Ryan home directory, you just call it ryanwashere.txt, wait about a minute, and the file shows up in the home directory and is created by root. So now we know we have some control over the underlying operating system. We can use that in the next steps.
All right, so to convert writing file to a disk as root is pretty cool, right? But what's even better? A reverse shell. So we modify the DB handler cron job that Ryan mentioned before, and we replace it with an interactive bash shell that connects back to our attacker-controlled machine, where we are just running a simple vanilla netcat listener, just looking for incoming connections. On the left-hand side, you can see us setting this malicious cron job, and on the right-hand side, on our attack box, we are able to catch the incoming reverse shell. On the right-hand side, I want you to pay attention to two things. First is the prompt of the shell that's received. It no longer says SE at the host name, which is the standard prompt for DDoS server that you can see on the left-hand side, but now it says bash 4.2, which indicates to us as attackers that we have successfully broken out of Dell's restricted jailed environment. And on top of that, the output of who am I now says root. So we are no longer pen test user on the left-hand side. We are root. We have pretty much broken out of all restrictions that's needed for us to work as attackers. So at this point, now that we have completely compromised this DDoS machine, our goal was to try attempting to delete the immutable data set that was set up for us. So here I want to call out two attacks that Ryan went over. The first one was dropping or overwriting the file system or dropping the file system. So we identified that our data set was actually mounted using a proprietary file system called Data Domain File System, or DDFS. So our idea was, what if we just use our root permissions and just unmount the file system? What would happen then? Turns out nothing happens. The device functions as well, as expected, because we used a backup and restoration software by Veritas called NetBackup to check if the connection was working, and surprisingly, NetBackup was still able to communicate with this Dell machine even after dropping the file system and function as expected. And the second attack that I want to call out, which sounds really cool in theory, is a rogue NTP server attack. So as I mentioned earlier, retention log is time-bound. So you have to set a time period of expiration. So that's after that time period is reached, your immutable data is no longer immutable. It's normal now. It can be overwritten. So our idea was to use our root privileges on this box to modify its NTP server, NTP configuration to point to our rogue NTP server. And when the time sync would happen, our device would respond with a time way ahead in the future, which would, in theory, unlock the retention log. Turns out Dell also thought about this edge case scenario, because on this Dell machine, you can only increment time in a period of 2 hours. So like I said, this machine supports an upper limit of 70 years for retention log. No attacker is going to sit there and do it, possibly if that's the last option. But we wanted something simpler and much easier to exploit. So we tried to figure out how this backup restoration operation works, or how the accessibility of this data is handled. And what we found out was the way this NetBackup device was able to restore by using this Dell machine was through a proprietary protocol called DDBoost. DDBoost is Dell's implementation of NetBackup's open storage APIs, which in simpler terms just means that it's a way for these two competing solutions to talk to each other. And for the DDBoost protocol to work, a local user has to exist on this Dell machine. So we used our root privileges and just nuked the DDBoost user's password from etc shadow. And when you do that on a NIC system, it effectively deletes the user altogether. To take it a step further, we also rotated the passwords of the local accounts that Ryan mentioned earlier, the sysadmin and secuser, and also deleted the LDAP connection that was set up on this Dell machine that would prevent, let's say, a strong domain account from logging in like a domain admin and undoing our malicious changes. Now, as a result of that, at this point, this Dell machine is completely compromised, first of all. Also, legitimate access has been cut off, so no one can use the data set on this, and no one can talk to this machine. No one can use the immutable data that's still immutable and sitting on this machine for disaster recovery operations. This is what an attack would look like. You would use a simple sed one-liner, look for the pattern DDBoost, and nuke it from etc shadow. And this is the console screenshot from NetBackup, where when you query the status of the Dell machine from NetBackup, it says the machine ending in 06 is marked as down. So NetBackup can no longer talk to this machine. No more disaster recovery.
So we reported this finding to Dell, and they rolled out a fix as part of this DSA. The fix is that SE mode is now completely deprecated, so you can no longer change or exploit the cron jobs the way we just demonstrated. So the lockdown shell is even more locked down than it was before. Our next solution was IBM's DS8000. That's comprised of 3 applications: the HMC hardware management console, the data storage of DS8000 itself, and the copy services manager, or CSM. They all live on the same physical device and same underlying operating system. The HMC, from what we can tell, handles a lot of the, well, obviously, hardware management, setting up things like users and different protocols and SSH, stuff like that. The DS8000, I think, sets up your partitions or some of the storage infrastructure. It was hard to tell. And then CSM handles, from what we can tell, the backup and restoration process. So our targets were the URLs provided to us by the backup team, but no credentials. This was production. They said, get access to the applications. That's your whole goal. If you get access to the applications, that can do a lot of damage, so that's your target. We took this to our leadership. They did tell us it is prod only, so if you do get access, you can't do anything, you can't break it, make changes. It's all production, so walk on eggshells. We took this to our leadership and said, this doesn't feel like it's in the spirit of testing immutable backups. This feels like a web app test. It's not really what we should be spending our time doing. He said, well, just take a little time, give it your best shot, see what you can do. So, grumbling, we go back to our desks, and 5 minutes later, we had access to 2 of the 3 applications with default credentials. These are the creds. They've been rotated in our environment, but use those as you will. So we now had access to 2 of the 3 applications, with our ultimate goal being to access CSM. Spoiler alert, we never did. But we had to now learn these environments without making any changes. We could do things like creating local users, but nothing that was enabling some feature that we shouldn't be doing. Because it's in use, it's backing up real data. One of the things we saw was this login screen for the HMC, that if you used one of the legitimate default credentials of CE, it would tell you CE is not allowed to log on remotely. Cool. It's enforced by disabling the logon button. I think you can probably see where this is going. You use your elite hacking tools of developer tools, remove the disabled flag, click logon, and you're in. So, cool. This is HMC. I'd love to show you more. It's huge. There's hundreds of pages. Every one of these menu options has dozens and dozens of subpages. It's enormous. One of the common things you would see a lot in HMC, though, is pages to view log files, lots of log files. Most of them are drop-downs to select the log file you want to view, but this one is freeform. You can just enter the login or the log file location you want to view. So if you give it Etsy password as a log file, it gives you an error that there was an error processing the request because Etsy password isn't a valid log file. But if you give it Etsy not a real file, it gives you a different error that the file doesn't exist. So now you can use that to start mapping out all the files that might exist on the operating system, like maybe the application files that are running these systems. We can use these in the next few steps.
All right, so after looking at the HMC web application, we set our sights on the DS8000 web application. And once we logged in, we quickly noticed there was this small shell utility inside in the web UI called DSCLI, which happens to be IBM's implementation of its own jailed environment like Dell has, right? So we had to look at it at this point. DSCLI functions in 2 modes. The first one is single command mode, where you type in the command and you get the output. We didn't have much success abusing that mode. So we moved on to the second one, which is the file upload mode, where you upload a valid script file for containing DSCLI commands, and it functions in 3 steps. The first step is the file gets uploaded to the temp directory. Second step, an execute method is called on the file in the temp directory, and it's executed line by line. And finally, the cleanup step happens. So let's look at each one of them and see if we can exploit it. So the first one is the file upload mode. Here you can see we are uploading a file that is not a valid DSCLI file because the shebang points to bin bash, and also ID and whoami are not valid DSCLI commands. But the application doesn't care. It doesn't validate. It lets you just upload the file in the temp directory. No exploit over here. You can't really abuse this step to break out of this temp directory, so it's fine. We can just move on to the next step. In the next step, the execute method is called on the file that was previously uploaded in the temp directory. And here I want you to pay close attention to the response. It says, first of all, it errors out, but the error message is interesting. It says, ID was not found, enter help for a list of available commands. So first of all, the ID command, since it's not a valid DSCLI command, it errors out, right? And the command itself, the command name in this case, ID, was printed on the screen. That's an important piece of information. Second, whoami was never executed. Right? So now we know that the way this feature works is it executes a file top to bottom. Whenever it encounters an error, it will stop the execution of the file, print the command that errored out on the screen, and then discard the rest of the file. Sweet. So now we know that we can potentially leak contents of a file in a very restricted fashion, possibly just the first line of a file that is not a valid DSCLI file. So this is where you give up. You can't do much with this restricted file read. Turns out this application runs as root. And what can root read? Etsy shadow. And what's the first line of Etsy shadow when it errors out? It's the root password hash. So we were able to leak the root password hash with this execute method. And also, turns out this happens to be another default cred. So we were able to crack it locally on our laptops in like less than 20 minutes. It's a dictionary word. Now for the final step, the cleanup. This is where once the execution is done, the remove script method is called and deletes the file on disk. So we were also able to abuse this method by targeting a file that is not in the temp directory. So we created a new user on the DS8000 web application, and when you do that, it creates a default, by default, it creates a .bashrc file for you. So we used the remove script method, targeted the bashrc file that was just created, successfully deleted it with root privileges. And when we use the execute method from the previous step to check the existence of the file, the output changes. It says script file is not found, successfully deleting the file.
So the impact of this is that we could access 2 of the 3 applications with default credentials, enumerate all the files on the file of the operating system, read the first line of any of those files as root, and delete any of the files as root. This is all implied, but surely if we found the right files for the applications or Etsy Shadow, we deleted them, we should be able to cause some sort of system outage. We couldn't do that because this was production, but it's an implied impact. We think we could probably take the system down that way. So our challenges were, again, we didn't have non-prod environment to test against. We didn't feel that this was comprehensive. If you have access to a DS8000 in non-prod that you can safely test against, we think there's possibility for a lot more findings here. We did report these 4 findings to IBM's PCERT, and they rolled out a fix early March of this year. We then moved on to AWS, which the AWS backup that uses the industry standard of compliance mode and retention lock. We use AWS organizations, which, if you don't know, is just comprised of many accounts in AWS, all rolled up under one organization account that sort of maintains the rest of them. It's like a billing account. It can pay for all the other accounts, so you don't have to have every department or every team paying for their own. Our backup team set up an account for us with data in it that was set to immutable, and it was just test garbage data. But that way we could use that as our target, the POC backup account. That's what our goal was to get access and potentially take that account down.
Okay, so let's talk about the methodology when it comes to testing cloud backups. So if people in the audience, if you have tested AWS, you know that very rarely will you be in a situation where you can just run an exploit and gain access and reach your goal in AWS. In reality, what it's going to look like is you're going to start with either no creds or a low privilege creds. From there, you're going to cred shuffle. By that I mean you're going to enumerate your permissions, escalate privileges, keep assuming roles till you reach your target. In this case, our target was reaching the POC backup account. So that's exactly what we did. We started from a perspective of an unauthenticated attacker inside an organization's network, and we quickly came across this container registry that didn't support authentication. Since it didn't support authentication, we were able to pull down a container that housed clear text credentials for a very privileged account called GitLab admin. By clear text, I mean base64 encoded, but it's base64. You can just reverse it. So now at this point, we started with no credentials to some sort of credentials, but we still don't have foothold in AWS. So we just went with what we had. We targeted GitLab with our GitLab admin credentials and logged into the admin area on our company's GitLab. So this admin area is a special area which is not accessible to normal devs in GitLab. You have to have some kind of privileges in GitLab to interact with it. And inside this admin area is this runners section, which houses the shared runners as well as private runners. Shared runners in GitLab is available to all devs, so you can just, anyone in your organization can use it to execute their code on it via CI/CD. Whereas private runners are reserved for special groups. The group in question that we wanted to go after was the AWS team, because our train of thought was, since it's a big organization, there is a good chance the AWS team uses some kind of automation, right? It could be Terraform, CloudFormation jobs, or even just plain old CI/CD pipelines. And our theory was right. The description of this runner was a dead giveaway. And also, here's another thing that I want you to pay attention to is the runner tag. So when it comes to private runners, you can't, even though for us, since we have the GitLab admin access, we still can't execute code on this runner by default. We have to meet 2 conditions. The first condition is we have to create a repo inside the AWS team's group. And second is in our CI file, we have to mention this tag. So we did that, and you can see on the screen, it took us like 5 attempts to find the right runner. And once we did, we realized this runner was in fact an EC2 instance. So when it comes to EC2 instances, you just query the metadata endpoint. That's exactly what we did. And we were able to leak the temporary credentials for that EC2 instance via job logs, use those in our AWS CLI file, and assume role as the runner. Now, at this point, we come from completely unauthenticated user to have some kind of foothold outside of AWS, and now finally compromising and getting credentials to interact with AWS. When we enumerate, so now we retry the cred shuffling method, and we realize that we were, in fact, in a separate account in our AWS organizations. So this account in question was the infrastructure prod, or the infra prod account, and we are still far away from a goal for the to get into the POC backup account. So again, we try to enumerate up permissions, and we quickly came across this management account in our POC backup account that has an assume role policy that lets our runner in question that we compromised in the previous step assume role into this management account. Sweet, now we're just one step away from getting into the management account. But turns out luck was on our side in this case, and this management account has the administrator access policy attached to it, which, if you've worked on AWS, you know that it's the default admin access policy that AWS provides to you. But that lets you do any action on any resource, effectively compromising the account if you assume role into it. So now I know that was a lot of steps when it comes to compromising AWS, and it's different for different organizations, but this is what it looks like from a high-level view. You come from outside of AWS, you compromise a Docker container that doesn't support authentication, you get cleared credentials. In this case, it turns out to be GitLab admin, compromise a GitLab runner, pivot into AWS in the infra prod account, and from there on, assume role and get into the POC backup account. Now let's talk about possible ramifications of this entire exploit chain. Can we stop backups? Turns out we can, because this management account, since it has wildcard on all actions and wildcard on all resources, you can use that to assume role into a special role in AWS backups called the backup policy deployer. That name might be different for different organizations, but the role functions in a pretty simple way. It has to exist. It lets you define the source of the backups, the destination of the backups, and the frequency of the backups. So targeting that role, you can modify those policies, you can delete those policies, you can override those policies, you can do whatever you want with it. You can effectively stop backups. And if no one is monitoring it, in our case, no one was, it's pretty good, fine. But we wanted to take it a step further. We wanted to cut off legitimate access like we did in our previous two case studies. So we tried to figure out how does the admin access for our AWS team work. And again, this is out of scope, but I still want to mention it because it's different. Different organizations manage it differently. But if your organization manages it using SSO, this is a pretty good path. Well, we found out that they were using SSO to handle their admin assignments. So to target that, we again went back to our step with a privileged runner that we compromised and started re-enumerating our privileges, and we eventually came across a Lambda job that was handling the admin assignments. So just assuming role into that account, targeting that Lambda job, you could cause wreak havoc, right? The other potential paths that you can explore, we didn't, because we couldn't get the credentials to get there, but you can, is attacking the root principal. Root principal for AWS is the account, is the first account that you get when you set up a brand new account. And with the root principal, you can delete the AWS account for this backups, but there are some checks and balances in place by AWS. It gives you a grace period of like 90 days to recover from or undo your changes.
So in all three of these solutions, we worked with the backup teams, and they told us, yeah, your attacks might have worked, but recovery would probably be possible, maybe with a vendor's help. And our point all along was, that's great, we weren't touching the immutable data, so recovery should be possible, but how long is that going to take? If it's going to take too long, your only option to get business back up and running might be to pay that ransom. And then what's the point in having an immutable solution? So recommendations for all of the solutions: change your default creds. It's common sense, right? Vault your creds and limit access to who should have those. MFA all the things. Alerting and monitoring is a big one. Most of these backup teams might not be large teams, and so if it's only a few people, having some alert when an account gets used to log in so that the maybe 3 people on that team know that somebody just used an account to log in to the immutable backup solution, but 2 of them are on vacation. Now we know something is wrong. So good to have alerts for that sort of thing. Keeping your software up to date, obviously, offsite backups, 3-2-1 rule. Allowing your security researchers to test, giving us a non-prod environment to hit so we can safely make sure that these are secure solutions in our own environment. Why you might want to include attacking immutable solutions in your attack landscape. Well, if you're using immutable solutions for disaster recovery scenarios and not concerned about ransomware, maybe it's not a big deal. But if you're using this for attack protection, it's probably a good idea to make sure that the servers can't be rendered inaccessible. As we've been saying, if the data is not accessible, can you really call it immutable? You shouldn't rely on your vendors to do all of the testing for you if it's in your own environment. They may be resting on their laurels and testing periodically, but if it's in your environment, you just want to make sure that it's as secure as you expect it to be. Ultimately, these solutions are just computers. They're built for one specific thing, and they do it really well, but they're just computers with the same problems as any other systems. A 5-minute Google search just gave us a bunch of other immutable solutions that are advertised, right? Azure and Google Cloud Storage, all these others. They all advertise some form of immutability in their offerings. If organizations are relying on them to protect their data and recover from ransomware attack, they should probably be tested too. There's no reason they may not also be vulnerable to the same techniques that we just demonstrated here. Quick timeline. For Dell, we reported to them in September of last year. They rolled out a fix, that DSA, in December, granting 1 CVE. And then for IBM, we reported to them in October, and they fixed the 4 issues in March of this year, granting 4 CVEs, including the one for developer tools. So to sum it up, as we've been saying, your data may be immutable, but the servers hosting it might not be. So you should probably make sure that they are if you want to make sure they're as secure as you expect them to be. You can increase ransomware resilience by testing your vendor's immutability solution. Make sure that they don't have the same vulnerabilities that can render them inaccessible. Because affecting the accessibility of backups may coerce payment for ransomware, which, in our opinion, is another form of holding the data ransom. So thanks. And with that, we can take questions.